Okay, so let's continue now with the trials of King David. And I wanted today to consider a very important question. We started off by saying that according to the Talmud, Yerushalmi, during the 6 months that David was in flight from his son Absalom during the revolt, we make a deduction. It says that if he committed a sin, if he had to bring a sin offering, he would bring a female goat. And we explained that a king or a prince, a nasi, brings a male goat as a sin offering, and a commoner brings a female goat. So since the Gemara says that during those 6 months that David was in flight from Absalom, he had the law of a commoner. He was no longer had the law of a king. So the question is, did he have the law of a commoner because he fled and he was no longer in his capital and he did not have the authority of a king? He had fled before his son. And therefore, what we would say, Mamela, that means in itself, without any further adjudication, he was a commoner because he didn't have the status of a king. Or do we say that there was a judicial inquiry, and as a result of that judicial inquiry, he lost the status of a king? And I wanted to say that on the evidence, it seems likely that there was some kind of a judicial inquiry. I won't go through all this again, but we said that when Absalom went to Hebron, on the face of it to bring sacrifices, but in fact to appoint himself king, he took 200 men with him from Jerusalem. They didn't know that he was taking 200. They thought they were going 2 by 2 because he had a letter from his father saying to 2 people, unnamed people, please accompany my son. And he went and he showed this to 1 pair, another pair, 100 people. So he had 200 people who went to Hebron. And the Talmud tells us that these were all important people who were members of the Sanhedrin, which is the high court. So why does he take 200 members of the Sanhedrin with him? It seems likely that he wanted to have some kind of judicial tribunal to remove David as the king. This was on the advice of his advisor, who was the power behind the revolt, who was Achitophel, the wisest man in the kingdom. And there are other reasons to support this. Even if we say there wasn't in fact a trial at that time, the whole question, of course, has been the subject of debate throughout the centuries, even up to today. And we see that one of the principal commentators on the Tanakh, who is the Abarbanel, brings an indictment against the king on 5 counts. Abarbanel is a very interesting man. He was one of the main advisors of Queen Isabella of Spain, or her husband, King Philip, I believe, at the time of Cromwell. And they say that he was one of the main supporters of Cromwell at the time that he left, not Cromwell, I'm sorry, my mind is kind of Columbus. He was one of the main supporters of Columbus, my mind is flashing back. He was one of the main supporters of Columbus. And many people think that Columbus was Jewish, partly because of Abarbanel's support. Abarbanel was also one of the Jews who were expelled in 1492 from Spain. And even though he was a very important, wealthy man, they thought that perhaps he could bribe his way. He decided that he would be expelled with his country.
Where did he go?
I think he may have gone to Italy. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Okay, so now, but don't quote me on that. So now he in his commentary brings, as we've said, 5 counts against King David. One is that he committed adultery. We know about the story. I won't go through all the details again. 2, that he tried to cover it up. 3, that he had Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, killed. 4, that along with Uriah being killed, there were also other innocent Jews who were killed at the same confrontation. And 5, after Uriah was killed and Bathsheba sat the period of mourning, he immediately took her to be his wife, without waiting a decent time. And so that's an indictment. And the Malbim, the great commentator, defends David against this indictment. So that even if there wasn't a trial in actuality, there was a trial in the literature. But I want to presume that there was some kind of a judicial tribunal at the time. That's why they had 200. Absalom and Achitophel brought 200 people with them, because Absalom had previously sent messengers throughout the kingdom, if you remember, saying, when you hear the shofar blown from Hebron, you know that I am the king. I'm proclaimed as the king. And you can't have 2 kings simultaneously. In order for the rebel to proclaim himself as a king, somehow or another he has to either depose or get rid of the previous king. So I said, well, let's say that there was a tribunal which was going to consider whether or not they could try King David. Well, the first question is, are you allowed to try a king? Because a king in those days was an absolute monarch, what we call an absolute monarchy. He had great power. Although a Jewish king is not absolute in that sense that he can do what he likes, he's subject to the law. But does it mean, therefore, that that in the sense that he may be subject to the law, what's the law? Can you judge him? If a king behaves improperly, can he be brought to trial? 2 aspects. Can he be brought to trial as a person who's committed offences? And secondly, can we remove him as a king? So since one of the requirements of being appointed a king is that the Sanhedrin had to approve the appointment, so it's logical that also, since they have the power to approve a king, they may have the power to remove a king. So I said that before deciding this important legal question, they wanted to know, well, what's the charges? Are there any charges against him? Because the court will not consider difficult legal questions unless there's some basis for it. They don't like to answer hypothetical questions. So we said this whole account and the Abraham's specification is clear evidence that there is something that it requires investigation. The simple understanding of the verse is exactly what the Abraham said. He committed adultery, he tried to do a cover-up, he had her husband killed, other people were killed, and then he takes it back very quickly. So now the question was that the tribunal had to consider, can we try a king? What are our powers to try the king? So the law of these matters is always stated by the Rambam, right? Because the Rambam in his Mishnah Torah states the law in all circumstances, not only the law as at the time that he was writing, when there wasn't a king and there wasn't a temple, and we weren't all in Eretz Yisrael, and the laws of agriculture didn't apply. Nevertheless, his code is a comprehensive code of Jewish law, which deals with all aspects of the law, even though they may not be applicable at any specific time. Unlike the Shulchan Aruch, for example, which deals principally with the law as it exists at the time it was written and today. So the Rambam says in the laws of kings, we have already explained that the kings of the house of David they are judged and we give evidence against them. but the kings of the house of Israel, the Chachamim, the sages, made a decree. The sages have powers to make decrees, that they should not be judged, and they do not judge, and we do not judge them. Why? Oh, he adds, and they shouldn't give evidence, and we can't give evidence against them. He says because their hearts are fat, they're conceited, they're arrogant, because they're arrogant. And the thing may come, or will come, v'yavo, it will come, he says, to a matter of a takala. Takala is, someone falls over, it's called a takala. It's a calamity, it's something that goes wrong. And there will be loss on the religion. In other words, the Rambam says the kings of the house of David have to be tried, but the kings of the house of Israel may not be tried, they may not judge, and they may not be judged because of their arrogance, and the thing will come to a bad result, and a loss. There will be a loss of the religion. He said he's already said so, and he said so in another place. A slightly different language, but I'll read it. The kings of the house of David, even though they don't sit in the Sanhedrin, we've learned that the king does not sit in the Sanhedrin in the court, but they do sit and judge the nation, and they are judged if they have a din, a case against them. But the kings of Israel are not judged, and they cannot give judgment because they do not humble themselves before the Torah. Slightly different language, but the same idea. Previously, in the laws of kings, he said because of their arrogance. And here he says because they do not humble themselves before the Torah. And maybe it will come a takala. In the other place he says maybe it'll come to some disaster, some calamity. In the other place he says it will, here he says it may. Okay. So first of all we see there's a distinction between the kings of the house of David and what we say are the kings of Israel. Now David, of course, is a king of the house of David. He was the father of the house of David. The kings of Israel normally talks about the kings of the northern kingdom. We know after David's son Shlomo, the kingdom was divided between the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. And the northern kingdom was subsequently conquered by Sanherib and came to an end. The people were scattered. But here, as we shall see, the kings of Israel doesn't mean only the kings of the northern kingdom. How do we know that? Because what is the source for this law that the king can be judged, but not the king? Only that applies to the kings of the house of David and not the other kings, the kings of Israel. So the law is stated in the Talmud Sanhedrin, which deals with laws. And remember that the Talmud consists of a Mishnah, which is a precise statement of the law, and then a commentary on the Mishnah, which is called the Gemara. Okay. So now, the Mishnah says very simply, as soon as I can find it, a king may neither judge nor be judged.
That's the halacha you're reading.
That's the halacha, that's the Mishnah.
Mishnah.
The Mishnah, which is a precise statement of the law, says, a king may neither judge nor be judged. It says so in general. It doesn't distinguish between the kings of the house of David and other kings. It says specifically, a king may neither judge nor be judged. And it doesn't give a reason. It states, the Mishnah in general does not give a reason. It states the law precisely. However, the Gemara comes to explain the Mishnah. And the Gemara says like this. Excuse me just a moment. It quotes, a king may neither judge nor be judged. Said Rabbi Yosef. Now Rabbi Yosef is a teacher of the Gemara, some hundreds in Babylon, some hundreds of years after the Mishnah. And a teacher, the rule of the Talmud is that a teacher of the Gemara, who's called an Amora, cannot argue with a Mishnah, which is an authoritative statement, but he can explain it. And he can clarify it. So comes along Rabbi Yosef, who's blind by the way, some hundreds of years later, and he says, when the teachers of the Mishnah said this, they were only talking about the kings of Israel. But the kings of the house of David, the Davidic dynasty, they judge and they may be judged. How does Rabbi Yosef in the Gemara, how does he know this? The Mishnah just said specifically, in general, kings cannot be judged and judged. How does he know that this is limited to the house of Israel but not to the house of David? Because he has a verse from the prophet Yirmiyahu. Jeremiah was some hundreds of years after David. It was at the end of the period of the first temple. Nevertheless, the nature of the prophecy is that it is eternal. It applies to all times. And the prophet Jeremiah said, Beis David Kama Hashem, the prophet is talking, or the Almighty is talking to the house of David, as the king, not David, many years later, but his descendant. The Almighty said, O house of David, Dinu levaker mishpat, get up early in the morning. In other words, he's telling the kings that they have to judge the nation, and they have to do it with alacrity. They have to get up early in the morning in order to judge the people. All right, so now he has a prophecy. The Almighty tells the house of David, you have to judge the people. Now we have a very important inference from that. The inference is that if a king is commanded to judge the people, that means that he also can be judged, because we are not in the line of those nations that a king can do what he likes and judge people, but he himself is immune. It's a very profound rule. If a king is given power to judge the people, it follows that that has to be reciprocal and he can be judged. That's a very deep understanding of the morality of the Jewish law as it relates to leadership and governance. If someone can govern and give judgment and make judgment, then he himself has to be subject to judgment. And furthermore, they bring a proof of that. Rabbi Yosef brought a proof from it from another verse in the prophets in Zechariah, which he says, or actually Reish Lakish, another one brought a proof and said, a verse says, Kashet atzmacha V'achar kach kashet achalem. He explains that the verse says, Hitkoshishu v'koshu. So hitkoshishu, really that's talking about kash. Simply speaking, it means you have to gather things. But it really means you have to search yourself and then search others. You have to correct yourself and then correct others. So although it's not specifically talking about judgment, it has this concept of reciprocity. If someone wants to judge someone else, he has to be judged himself. He wants to tell other people what to do, he has to be clean himself. There's no room for hypocrites. Okay. So now, according to Rabbi Yosef, it's very clear from the prophet that a king may be judged, because there's a commandment that he has to judge people, and we say that's reciprocal. If he can judge people, he has to be judged. So how come the Mishnah says that the kings are not judged? That goes against the words of the prophet. So that's why Rabbi Yosef says, well, the Mishnah is not talking in general, it's only talking about the kings of Israel. Now when he says the kings of Israel, we shall see from the story. How do we know that? We know that from a story that happened, which is in the Gemara at this point. And it talks about King Yanai. So King Yanai was one of the last kings at the end of the Second Temple, when we came back from Babel, after the whole period of the Hasmoneans and the revolt against the Greeks. We had a dynasty. We know King Herod is one, perhaps the most known or infamous of that dynasty, and one of the others in that dynasty was a king called King Yanai. So he was also a very arrogant man, and there are numbers of stories about him. But the Gemara brings a particular story to tell us how it was that the rabbis made a rule that the kings of Israel may not be judged. So it says it's because of a certain incident that happened. So King Yanai had a slave, and the slave killed someone. So the head of the great Sanhedrin was Shimon ben Shattach, a great rabbi, who I believe was in fact the brother-in-law of King Yanai. So he said, well, this slave has killed someone, let us put your eyes upon him and judge him. We'll judge the slave for murder, for killing someone. So they sent to the king, and they told him, your slave killed a person. So Yanai sent his slave in front of the court to be judged. But that wasn't sufficient. The court then said to Yanai, it's not enough for your slave to come, you also have to come. You must come here and appear before us.
Why?
Very good. Because the verse says that if or when an ox kills a man, he has to be warned by the witnesses. In other words, in the laws of damages, an ox, let's say it's unusual for an ox to be a killer. Most cattle and oxen are fairly, perhaps by their nature, although they're not so tame, but they are not wild animals. So a person has a responsibility to look after his ox. But if the ox kills someone, and then let's say kills someone again, and perhaps a third time, so then he's a very dangerous animal, or even if he attacks other animals 3 times. So the owner has to come to court each time and be warned, you know, your ox is a dangerous animal. You have to watch him. So therefore, when an ox is brought to court, the owner has to come to court. And the rabbis here make a similarity between the law relating to an ox and the law relating to an eved, a slave. Now in fact, the law is that a person is generally not liable for damages that may not be liable for damages that a slave does.
Really?
The reason is because if the master was liable for, let's say the slave goes out and burns down a barn or something, or goes and damages property. So if the slave has a grudge against his master, he says, I'll go out and I'll burn down every barn that I can see, I'll cause as much damage as I can, and my master will have to pay for it. So therefore, that's why we make a rule that the master is not responsible for the damage that the slave does. It's also true, a man in strict law is not liable for the damage that a child does. This comes up very often in practical terms. Kids go and break something, they throw a stone, they break a window. Is the father liable?
Nobody's responsible?
Well, now that depends. If the slave becomes free and gets some money, so then maybe now he has some money he has to pay. But at the time, he's not responsible. We would also hold as a matter of good conduct and ethics, perhaps the father should pay for the damage. But in strict law, you can't make him liable. So if in strict law, the king Yanai was, the servant killed someone, why should he have to come to court? So there are two possible reasons. Well, one is, well, if they were going to kill the servant or the slave, that would cause a loss of money to the king, so he would be involved about it. Secondly, perhaps he had to be warned. He said, look, you've got this slave, he goes around killing people, you have to be careful. So they sent for Yanai.
They said?
The court sent for Yanai and said, you have to come here. So he came to court, and Shimon ben Shattach, who was the head of the court, said to him, Yanai, the king, King Yanai, you have to stand on your feet and they will give evidence against you. What does it mean, evidence against you? It's as if they were testifying against him because it would be a monetary loss.
Because
it would be a loss for him. Now in general, in civil cases, the litigants are only required to stand when the verdict is announced, in a money case. But in a case involving a criminal matter which involves the death penalty, then the person must stand. So now, the head of the Sanhedrin says to the king, you have to stand up. So the king said, I'm not going to stand up, I'm the king, I'm doing you a favor to come here in the first place. But I'm not on trial. I'm not going to stand up. So the Rabbi Shimon ben Shattach said to him, you're not standing up before us. It's not our kavod, it's not our respect, our honor that you have to stand up. Rather, you're standing before the one who spoke and the world came into being. Very interesting. One of the ways that the Chazal, that the Talmudim, the sages refer to the Almighty is the one who spoke and the world came into being. Don't think that it happened by chance or on its own. The world didn't come into being on its own. Of course, we didn't think they thought that. Perhaps they thought that even in those days. So it says, you're standing before the one who spoke and the world came into being. Why? Because when a court considers the matter that comes before it according to the law of Torah, then the Almighty is present in the court. You see that in Pirkei Avos. When a court acts according to the law of Torah, so the Almighty is present. So Shimon ben Shattach says to him, you have to stand up not before us, but before the Almighty, because the Almighty is here in the court. It's a verse, the two parties to the dispute shall stand, and it says before Hashem, before God. So Yanai says, I'm not going to take notice of what you say, Shimon ben Shattach, you're one man. Let's see what everyone says. There's a court here. Presumably it was a court of 23. To try a man or even a slave on a capital offence requires a court of 23, not the Sanhedrin of 71, but a court of 23. So he says, well, let's see what everyone else says. How are they going to judge the case? Do I have to stand up or not?
Because he's a king, he doesn't.
Because I'm a king, I don't know.
That's the only reason.
The only reason would be, or maybe because I'm not even a party, I'm only coming because I'm affected on the side. But he says, well, it's the respect of the court you have to stand up. So now why did he say, well, I'm not going to listen to you, I'm going to listen to all the other people? Because he knew that they were all frightened of him. Shimon ben Shattach was not frightened of him, but he was a despot. Other stories about him. And he thought they would be frightened of him. So he says, I'll do according, if everyone agrees with you, that's one thing. But in the meantime, I'm not going according to you. See what the court says. So now, Shimon ben Shattach turned to the judges on his right. Usually the senior judge of the Sanhedrin, let's say he sat in the middle, and there was judges to his right and judges to his left. So he turned to the right and said to the judges there, well, what do you say? And they looked to the ground. They wouldn't answer. They didn't want to say. They knew he should have stood up, but they should support the head of the court, but they were frightened of the king, so they didn't. They looked at the ground. So thou, Shimon ben Shattach, looked to the left, and they also looked to the ground. Not one of the court supported him in saying that the king should stand up. So Shimon ben Shattach said to them, Baalei Machshavot, you're all, Baalei Machshavot is someone who thinks a lot. Instead of doing what he thinks, what he should do, he thinks, maybe I should do this, maybe I shouldn't do that. He prevaricates. In other words, he has all kinds of reasons not to do what he's supposed to do. So he says to them, you're all Baalei Machshavot, you're all men of thought. Yevov Baal Machshavot v'yifamechem. So the master of thought, that means the Almighty, he is the true master of thought. All thought comes from him. He says, may the master of thought come and he'll pay back from you. He'll get retribution from you. Shimon ben Shattach was very, very upset that none of them would support him. And he called, so to speak, to the Almighty to come and take retribution from the other judges. So what happened? Miyad, immediately, Bar Gabriel came. Gabriel, the Malach, the angel Gabriel, who is the angel of din, of justice and law and rules. He came into the court and he knocked them all to the ground and they all died. All the other judges, let's say the 22, he came, the angel Gabriel came, bang, 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 they all fall to the ground and they all die. Terrible story. So at that time, the sages, I suppose, the surviving sages, said, we're not going to have this again. A king cannot judge, and he may not be judged because of this terrible disaster. So first of all, although Yanai was not exactly the king of Israel in the northern kingdom, he was king actually of the southern kingdom, because that was all that was left at that time. Nevertheless, he wasn't a king of the house of David. So the sage said, look, the kings are very arrogant, and they don't humble themselves before the Almighty and before the law. So we can't have this kind of thing happen again, because it will bring the law into disrepute. Even let's say it didn't happen that they all died. Nevertheless, the whole law and the system of law is brought into disrepute. If there's a battle, a struggle between the king and the legal system, we can't have that. You see, also in our time. So therefore it's better, we'll avoid the whole problem and say a king can, since we're going to say a king cannot be judged because he won't listen to what's going on, so we'll make that reciprocal and he cannot judge. And but what about the house of David? What we've learned that the house of David, they were not all totally righteous men. If someone had tried to judge Manasseh, he would have had them killed at the very first moment. But nevertheless, we remember that the verse said, the prophet says, O house of David, get up in the morning and judge me. So therefore there was a specific command from the Almighty directed to the house of David that they should judge and be judged, but the house of Israel not so. That means judges, even Yanai, although he wasn't actually the house of Israel, but he wasn't a king from the house of David. So therefore they made that regulation. So therefore we see that there is authority that the house of David can judge and be judged. Now, even though all these events happened many hundreds of years after the episode of David, nevertheless, the law of the Torah is eternal. And even though the law in any particular case may not be specifically written or decided until a certain date, that law always existed. That the clarification that when Jeremiah and Jeremy says, house of David, get up early in the morning and judge, and we learn that that also means be judged, that goes all the way back to King David. So if that's correct, then it means that on the basis of the events as described in the book of Shmuel, chapter 11, the whole story of Bathsheba and Uriah, there's something now that has to be judged. What the nature, if there was a tribunal, what the nature of that tribunal is and the procedure is not discussed. But I want to just throw a few suggestions. First of all, in general, under Torah law, you can't trial someone in his absence. It has to be before the court. In a civil case, a dispute between two parties, both of them have to come to court. If one refuses to come to court, it is not judged. And in a criminal case, a case involving what was in a nefashot, the defendant has to be brought to court.
If you don't, there can't be a trial.
So that's the question. If not, well, what's the point of it? Can you trial someone, what we say, absentee, that is not there, and decide, let's say a case of murder, killing, right? There are witnesses that Reuven killed Shimon, and Reuven runs away and is goes to America or something. goes to another place where the court can't get him back. And the witnesses come and say, well, you know, he killed the person. Can the court judge the case in the absence of the defendant and say, well, he's guilty, and when we catch him, we'll kill him?
No.
No. I would say what the court can do is to say, well, when we find him, we will bring him to court against his will, and we will judge him in front of him and see what he says. He has his opportunity to defend himself, but he certainly has to appear in court. And if he's not here, we'll have to wait until we can get him. So it is, and now I'm moving into an area of speculation, but it may well be the case, because we'll see from the sequence of events that the court said, well, there's certainly grounds here that David has to justify himself, right? Look at these terrible things that happen. So maybe they said, well, he has to come to us and justify himself. We'll see that there are certain statements of the Chazal, of the sages, that support such a proposition. But he didn't come to himself. We shall learn, perhaps next week, the sequel to this, and what happened to David, the beginning of his flight. But let's say, well, we've certainly heard enough to make us consider now whether there's going to be a trial against him for these specific offences of adultery, etc., or whether there's going to be a kind of impeachment tribunal where we remove him from the king, being king. That also is a matter of speculation, yes.
Do they have to impeach him to trial?
That's a very good question. Probably not, because the Rambam doesn't talk about impeachment or removing him as a king. They say he can be tried. However, it may be that Absalom at that stage was more interested in having him impeached, removed as king, because he had already said, when you hear the shofar blown, you know that I have been appointed king. So we could speculate about that. The interesting thing, one of the interesting things, that Absalom had sent messengers saying, when you hear that throughout the country, when you hear the sound of the shofar, you know that I have been appointed king in heaven. The verses do not say that he blew the shofar or that he was appointed king. However, it seems implicit from the way he acts after this and his march on Yerushalayim that he assumes the authority of the king. And particularly if we say, according to the Gemara that we learned, that when David was in flight from Absalom, he was not a king, he was a commoner, it's reasonable to make an inference from that Absalom himself appointed himself king, or was appointed king, and acted with the authority of a king. So, at that point in the drama, we see that on the one hand, in Hebron, it would appear likely that there was some kind of judicial tribunal which showed at least cause that David should come before them, either to be tried on the specific charges or perhaps to be impeached and removed as king. And that he didn't come, and that at that time they may have said, well, there's enough here at least to remove him from the time being as being a king until he comes to defend himself. And that gives Absalom the opportunity to appoint himself as a king and to march on Yerushalayim to take over the kingship. So that is a very important move now in the whole story. That the revolt, as the verses say, the revolt grows and gets stronger. And very interestingly, we should see that David's immediate reaction was not first to fight.
To fight.
Well, he's going to fight, but at that time, he's not fighting, he flees. Why he does that? It must be, as we shall see, that he thought that he did not have the power to oppose Absalom at that time. Later on we'll see how the whole story changes. And we'll have to consider very carefully the position of Yoav, his general, who was in charge of his army, and where he stood at that time in the revolt. That we'll have to consider at a further time, but what I thought today we've learned were very interesting is the whole question, the halachic legal question of whether the king may be tried and whether in fact there was some kind of trial in Hebron.